Welcome to Upwell, the podcast. I'm Sarah, and this is my beautiful co-host, Katie. As fellow female entrepreneurs turned friends and now business partners, we are so happy you're here.
With every episode, it is our sole purpose to share authentic conversations to inspire your personal level up. Take our curiosity, add your best intentions, and flow with us in the Upwell. Hey everybody, welcome to Upwell the Podcast. I am Katie and this is Sarah. Welcome back to another episode.
Hello. I'm excited that we're switching roles today. You can clearly see that we are floundering.
We're a little flustered, yeah.
We're super excited because we have another amazing guest with us today. His name is Eric Perterson. He is the CEO of Project Headspace and Timing. He is the host of the I'M F.I.N.E Podcast, a military veteran, husband, father, and an active member of our community. Welcome.
Thank you. I really appreciate being here.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Well, tell us a little bit more about who you are, what you do. Give us the gist of all of the things.
The elevator pitch.
Yeah.
Yes.
Please.
Okay. So, born and raised in this area. I went to Herscher High School. I joined the Army National Guard between my junior and senior year. And then shortly after my senior year, I deployed to Afghanistan. One tour, combat, came back, became a paramedic for Riverside Ambulance. And at that time, I realized that I was having like a hard time. I just wasn't fitting in. At least I felt like I wasn't fitting in, and I was just having a really hard time transitioning back into the civilian world. And so I went back overseas with a company called Triple Canopy. People are familiar with a company called Blackwater, a private military contracting company. I worked for a company that took over for them when they got in trouble in Iraq. So I did 2 more rotations in Iraq with them as a private military contractor medic that was rolling out on teams doing essentially the same thing I did when I was in the infantry. And then I did another 3 rotations in Afghanistan with the Department of Defense for a company called Global. And my wife is my best friend. I've been with her through all of this stuff. And she was like begging for me to come home. And I wasn't listening, which is shocking. My husband, right?
My husband listens every time I say something.
And despite knowing that I had like a really good support system and a really good family and obviously a really good wife, I didn't want to come home. I didn't really realize why. And so finally I was like, okay, I'll come home. And I got a job doing executive protection. I was in New York for a year. And so I still wasn't home. And again, she was like begging me, please come home. And so then I took a job as a private investigator. And I was living in an airport like 3-4 days out of the week. And I did that for years. And then it took the suicide of a man that I was a medic to like kind of shake me to my core and just really make me realize like, holy shit, like I need to do something different. And the reason why was because he was so insanely positive that when I found out that he killed himself, I was just like, I was questioning myself, because if he could do it, anybody could do it. And so that was the eventual thing that like kind of shook me, got me to quit everything I was doing, come home. I started a nonprofit called Project Headspace and Timing. The first thing I did was a town hall event where I just let veterans just share whatever they wanted with the public, knowing that it was going to be free of judgment and like nobody was going to say anything. They could say whatever they wanted. They could yell, they could cry, whatever. And that went exceptionally well. And then I started going to the veterans home, and I just started out by bringing beer and just hanging out. And I had a lot of fun doing that. I realized that getting veterans together just felt good. And so I just continued to do that, and we watched it grow and grow and grow. We started doing more outreach events where we were getting veterans together to do like constructive and productive things in nature. We were working with veterans, getting them into our communities more, because I think a lot of veterans want to like push away from their communities, which I understand, but communities need their veterans and veterans need their communities. So you got to be a little vulnerable, right? And so we started getting linked up with other nonprofits like Sleep in Heavenly Peace to deliver beds, and the Dwayne Dean Behavioral Health Center, so we could do days with dads at some of the schools. And it's just been, a wild ride since then. Then we had a crisis intervention program that we started up too. So we just keep watching it grow every day.
I love all of that. And I think, I personally have never been in the military. My husband served in the Navy. But something that, is apparent to me as a civilian, I suppose, is the people that join the military want to be of service. And I think everything you're doing really is so special because it allows those people to reintegrate into their communities. Like you said, you didn't want to come home because you probably, I don't think that there's a great system that I see, correct me if I'm wrong, I've never been in the military, but when you come home from wherever you're serving or whatever you're doing, it's just like, okay, now just go back to being normal, go back to your life and figure it out. There's not great things and places for people to come together and be and feel of service still. So I love everything that you've created because I think that's so important. So I want to hear more about your personal mental health struggles, or kind of, I don't know, just your journey with going through some of that and how you alchemized it into all of this.
Yeah. So mentally, I struggle with depression. I always struggled with anxiety. I always had anxiety, and as dumb as it sounds, it's because, so I grew up in Kankakee, and I got bullied a lot, just because kids get bullied, you know what I mean? There's nothing in particular. And I was getting bullied to the point where my parents made the decision that we needed to go somewhere else. So we moved to Limestone. And like, I'm not trying to date myself, but like, if you've ever seen the movie Save the Last Dance, I feel like I was a reverse version of that. It's like I started in Kankakee, and then I moved to Limestone, and I don't know how to dance. So I went out there, and I was also getting bullied a bunch. And a lot of it pertained to the way I look, because I'm Asian, I'm Filipino. And so from an equality perspective, it's nice because I got equally beat up by all of the other races.
Everybody.
Like, that's really nice. And it was just like, the problem is I started associating any sort of attention with negativity because I was just getting bullied, for my looks and all this other stuff. And so I never wanted attention. So anytime I ever got attention, I would just like shut down. And so that anxiety, that social anxiety and social pressure, all of that stuff was always there. And it really came back when I got back from Afghanistan. Like, I think my time in service kind of triggered that and maybe made it a bit worse. And then I did have, I do have PTSD because I did see some combat. I think it's tough because that is such a broad term. And there are when you talk about combat, there are the people, the veterans that went house to house and had 16-hour firefights and all that Blackwater or Black Hawk Down stuff, and that wasn't me. Like every firefight I was in was relatively short, but I still just had a lot of issues, I guess, with understanding who I was. I think a lot of it when I first came home, and a really popular issue amongst veterans is like, I forget what they call it. I think it's like adjustment disorder, something along those lines. And then stacking on everything on top of that, my depression, my anxiety being around everybody else, some survivor's guilt for some of the combat that we were in, all that kind of stuff just really added up. And deploying, executive protection, being a PI, it was all ways for me to just kind of sweep it under the rug. And like, I would talk to my therapist about it, and I'd always tell her that I feel like my brain is the warehouse in Raiders of the Lost Ark. And it's like something bad happens to me, and I put it in a box, and I just shove it in the back of the warehouse.
That's a veteran thing. Or a man thing. Maybe that's a male
thing.
thing.
I think it's a man thing for sure.
And I'm just like, I'll deal with that later. And then I would go to the gym, and that would be my place to open the box and let it all out. And then my therapist was like, you know that you don't get to control that, right? Like, it might all just start to leak out
whenever you want.
And that's what started to happen. And so as I was doing the executive protection work, like, I started getting into drugs a little bit, and I started getting all these other destructive things. And I don't know if part of that was because I didn't think I deserved to be happy, so I wanted to self-destruct. I didn't want to deal with these things that I felt very vulnerable discussing, so I just tried to find other ways and other outlets. But all of that, that was when I was probably in my darkest point. And the biggest thing that got me out of that, honestly, was reading, because I realized that there were so many people that had been through so much worse than myself. And luckily, a lot of them had wrote about it.
Yeah.
And so I felt like I am not particularly religious, and I have no problem with it at all, but I really gravitated towards philosophy, and I gravitated towards stoicism.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so when I was at my worst point, I found Meditations by Marcus Aurelius.
Yes.
I found
Mhm.
Tim Ferriss. He wrote
Yes.
The Tao of Seneca.
Uh-huh.
I read that. And like all of a sudden, between reading those books, reading Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse, and Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl,
Mhm.
like all those things started making me understand that these things that I thought that made me weak actually make me strong. And I need to embrace that and understand that. And that's kind of what started me on the way out of it. A balance between that, obviously, again, my support system, my wife who's been there from the very beginning, and then the gym was also very big for me. I used to compete in amateur strongman competitions until, unfortunately, like I did injure my back before, so it was a pretty stupid idea for me to be like, oh, deadlift in a car sounds really cool. And then I did that for a little while because honestly, working out is my best stress relief, without a doubt.
For most people.
For most people,
definitely.
for sure.
Yeah.
And yeah, so it was like an amalgamation of those things that I think helped me get over the initial hump of dealing with all the things I was dealing with.
Yeah, definitely. Can you share, I mean, maybe you don't know any off the top of your head, but any statistics for people that are listening that maybe don't know how, with the gravity of the problem, you know, the issue in this country with mental health and our veterans?
Yeah, it's hard. There's a number that goes around 22 a day, right?
Yep.
And everybody says 22 a day. But that number, there's problems with that number. I mean, it goes up and it goes down. And I don't believe that they count, like if a veteran dies doing something recklessly, well, where are we going to draw the line on if that's suicide or not?
Right.
But a startling statistic to me is that the Governmental Accountability Office did a study on how many veterans were killing themselves on VA campuses, because so many veterans were killing themselves on VA campuses. And in 2 years, it's from like 2017 to 2019, I think it was like 44, no, it was more than that, but somewhere between 45 and 50 veterans had taken their own lives on a VA campus, which is taking everything to another level. Because not only are in that moment are you saying, I'm done, you're saying, I'm done and I want you to know about it.
Correct.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, I mean, that was like...
the magnitude of that is huge.
Oh my God. So that was insane to me. So, I mean, that is one of the most problematic statistics, I think. And then I don't have statistics on this, but one of the things that I notice in the crisis intervention perspective is like roughly 95% of all the veterans that I respond to, according to the study that I just made up in my head, is like, it's all triggered from a relationship, a divorce, or something like that. And I've gotten to do some training with the National Guard, which was cool because I've treated some currently serving National Guardsmen. And I got to go down to Springfield to work with their chaplains to show them what I do. And they were telling me what they do. And they're making more of an effort to work with veterans, well, currently serving service members and their spouses, which I think is so important.
That's huge.
Because it's like, I won't be the first one to reach out for help, but my wife, like when it came to my issues, my wife saw it before I saw it because I wasn't willing to acknowledge it.
Right.
And she was like, I've noticed that you're acting different.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So getting families involved in stuff is so huge, I think.
Yeah.
You know?
I agree. Well, I guess in your opinion, why do you feel it's such a prevalent problem, you know, in America and probably all across the world, but, you know, for veterans especially, but even grand scale mental health crisis?
So there's so many pieces to this in the veteran space, right? One is that the term veteran encompasses arguably the most diverse group of people that fit under one label, right? You have people from all walks of life that can join and serve in the military, right? But the other part of it is, like, have either of you ever really loved being a part of any team sport?
Yes.
Okay, what was it?
I was a cheerleader.
Okay.
I was in cross country, but yeah, I loved it.
So, and what did you love about it?
the community, the camaraderie, you know, and just having the support and being supportive, you know, working toward a common goal.
Mine was the friendship, the bond, the friendship, and just kind of, you know, like when we would go to camp, like we were all in, like we lived together for, you know, that week and a half that we would go to camps, and like, you know, the practices together, and like
a shared mission.
It wasn't even a shared mission. It was like we knew everything about each other and what was going on in each other's lives, and we knew, you know, granted high school, you know, we knew who had a crush on who, and, you know, like schoolwork, all of that. So it was just kind of that, it was like this built-in group of friends that I got to have for a very extended period of time.
So you take that and you think about that, because I think everybody has an experience like that where they were part of a team and it just felt great being a part of a team. And if you ask anybody why it feels good, they say the same thing, right? So you take that and you imagine if you were with those people 24 hours a day, 365, and in addition to that, going through some of the most traumatic experiences that a human being can go through, right? And being there for each other. So like, you have these people from all walks of life that join the military, and they go through it. They find that family, that team, that whatever you want to call it.
That brotherhood.
And then all of a sudden it's gone.
Yeah, it's just ripped from them.
That in and of itself is a problem.
Yeah.
Now add in past trauma. Add in all
childhood trauma, anything. Yeah.
All of the people that had trauma before they got in the military that maybe didn't have a family. Now I have a family. Now I have people that care for me, that would kill for me, that would die for me. And then it gets ripped away. So then you think about how much worse it is for those people. And then you think about the veterans that go through trauma while they're in service and they lose those members of their team. So like it's really complicated.
It's layered.
There's so many layers.
Yeah, it's like big old onion.
Right? And so I think that a lot of it's an amalgamation of all those things that make up the problem. And you see how people have done it in the past to try to solve it. Legions, the VFWs, it's just trying to create a group space again.
Correct.
Right? Where we're trying to tell people it's okay, you can come here. We won't judge you. We love you unconditionally. It's okay. And you just need to see more of that. And I think we're seeing that more now, which is great. And I also think that we have to expand that out to not just, again, the veterans, but their entire family. Yeah. Because their family's going through it too. And that was a hard thing that I had to realize. Like, I didn't realize how much trauma my wife had been through by being with me through all these deployments. And I had this ego, or whatever you want to call it at first, where I was like, you don't understand. You didn't go through it. But in actuality, I was on the phone with her on my first deployment. I was in MWR, a plywood building. And the building next to me got hit by rockets. And then there was small arms, or there was machine gun fire. And she heard it on the phone. And she had to hear me go, I love you, I have to go by. And then I had to hang up. And when I called her back 4 hours later, she sounded like she had just finished running a marathon after watching Marley and Me. Or so, she was just like exhausted and
crying.
Yeah. And so I didn't realize, and that was my fault. And that was another thing that was good for me to learn, was how traumatic it was for her to go through that stuff too. So by including families in that process, is so important, I think, too.
Yeah. And I think too, it's not only for the spouses, but for the children of military, because they're, you know, like we talked about, there is a lot of things that happen in adulthood, a lot of times stem from childhood trauma. So that childhood trauma of having a parent in the military could lead to things in their life, you know, growing up. So I think it's not only just for the spouse, but for the children as well, like, because they are so impressionable and so they absorb so much of what's going on. So that's huge. Are there any programs or anything in place right now within the service that kind of gear towards, you know, like active military that gear towards like the spouse and the children for anything?
I see chaplains, like the chaplain corps. They seem to really be trying to spearhead that, at least from like a local perspective. I mean, there is. Can I tell you my favorite story?
Absolutely.
About veterans that have to also deal with like kids and stuff.
Absolutely.
Okay. So, do you guys know who Alan Milne is?
I don't.
I don't.
This is my favorite story. So, Alan Milne was a British soldier in World War I.
Okay.
And he fought in the Battle of the Somme. Okay, it was one of the bloodiest battles of human history, right? 3 million service members went in. 1 million were either injured or killed.
Okay.
And Alan was injured. So he goes home, he's got PTSD, arguing with his wife, and he has a son named Chris. And his son, Chris, and he decide to go to the zoo, and they start going to the zoo on like a regular basis, and that's like their thing now. And so they go to the zoo and they see this bear, and they love seeing this bear. And Alan loves the bear because he's reserved and he stays away from all the other bears, kind of like how Alan feels. And Chris likes the bear because he's cute and cuddly, right? So Alan decides to write a story for his son. And what some psychologists have now said is they believe, because we'll never ask him because unfortunately he's not with us anymore, but they believe that Alan was trying to explain what it meant to have PTSD. Okay, and he did it through a cast of characters. One of them was a depressed donkey, and the other was a tiger that would bounce off the walls, and the other was a paranoid pig, and the other was a kangaroo.
Winnie the Pooh.
So Alan's son was Christopher
Robin Mills.
Alan's name as an author was A.A. Milne.
Yep.
And so
As you started to say this, I was like, this is Winnie the Pooh. Yeah.
And so it's like, it's amazing that a veteran, for the love of his son, can take all the pain that he's feeling and turn it into something that a kid can understand, right? That outlives him to the point where nobody knows. Like, I told that story 1 billion times and nobody knew that the guy who wrote Winnie the Pooh was in he was in trench warfare in one of like the bloodiest battles of human history. And then he comes up with that. You know what I mean? So there's definitely a direct line for veterans to be able to explain things to their children and to get children involved. You know what I mean? And I think that, Mr. Milne did an amazing way of explaining that.
Absolutely.
That's one of my favorite stories.
I love that
That was
story.
a beautiful story.
Yeah.
I will never share it that eloquently.
Yeah.
So I'll just direct people to you.
I'll direct them to this episode and be like, listen to this snippet of this episode.
22 minutes in.
Thank you.
I want to know, for anybody that's listening, whether they are retired military, veteran, active military, or family member, what are some of the best resources for support that you know of?
So a lot of that depends on where you're located, right? Now, one thing that I will always support are veteran assistance commissions. Now, they go by different names depending on where you're at. Technically, almost every county is supposed to have one. And it's kind of like a end-all, be-all encyclopedia for veteran resources. So it's a great place to go, regardless of where you live, just to see what's in your area. But then, I think according to GuideStar.org, there are roughly 46,000 nonprofits that just work with veterans outside of the VA. So it's tough because that in and of itself is a barrier. Like if you have a veteran that doesn't want to deal with their stuff already, and now you're saying, all right, pick from this list of 46,000 organizations, they're like, you know what, I'm fine. So I think that like starting local, VACs, your VFWs, American Legions, we're seeing something really cool happening with a lot of VFWs and American Legions, to include your husbands, where they're realizing that like bars are fine. If that's your scene, that's your scene. But there are also some veterans who don't want that scene anymore. They want to be outside. They want to do events with their families. You know what I mean? And so I think getting in touch with your local American Legions and VFWs is really important. Wounded Warrior has become a supporter of ours, which is great. They've definitely been putting more emphasis on helping rural veterans. And then also look for any like coalition organizations in your area. So like in Illinois, I'm part of a group called Illinois Joining Forces. And so it's like a really big group of all veteran organizations and the VA. Most of them are in Chicago or Springfield, but they're really making an emphasis to get, again, to the rural veteran community because there's so many veterans out here. So I would definitely check out any of those. If you're local in Kankakee County, obviously you have us, Project Headspace and Timing up in Peatone. You have Adopt a Soldier. You have Sleep in Heavenly Peace, which is a great organization. You have Let's Catch Up. There's so many amazing organizations.
Awesome. And we will link, I'll get a full list from you, a more extensive list, and I'll put all the links in our show notes. But I want to hear more about Project Headspace and Timings for any of our local listeners, or, I hope, because what you're doing is so important, I hope that you have dreams of expanding, further reach than just our local area. But I want to know, how that got started, what you guys focus on, and then I want to also know about your Troops on Trails program.
Yes. So the idea for the nonprofit really kind of started from that initial town hall meeting. And the town hall meeting I got from a book called Tribe. And Tribe is by Sebastian Junger, war journalist. He wrote The Perfect Storm also, that became a movie the same name.
I've actually read that.
And phenomenal author and journalist. And in Tribe, he suggested doing a town hall event. So we kind of followed that. And when I realized that it just felt good to do that, I think I mentioned I started doing things over at the Veterans Home, and I was spending all of my own money to do all these things. And my wife was like, we can't.
Dude, stop.
It's like, we have children now,
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So I realized that starting a nonprofit was the best idea. We initially started by doing those types of outreach events, and all I knew at the very beginning was I wanted to help veterans. And I just saw the need, and I didn't want to start another nonprofit because there's 46,000, but I didn't see anything getting done immediately in front of me. So I just decided to start doing that and filling in any need where it would pop up. So outreach was big. Initially, my biggest goal was to build a transitional tiny home lodging facility for homeless veterans. And so we started working on that. We had blueprints. I was touring facilities across the country to see which model I thought would be best. And then COVID happened. And then all of a sudden I was getting way more crisis calls and veterans that were just not doing good, that were locked away in their homes, that needed an outlet. So we started Spartan Shield, which is our crisis intervention program. So we have veterans that are trained in mental health and first aid, and we work with local law enforcement and hospitals. So if they get a veteran that identifies as a veteran in any sort of crisis, they call us, and we'll provide a veteran, not to provide any treatment, but just to let them know, like, it's okay, that these people are here to help you. We're here to help you. I know where you are right now because I've been there. So I'm just going to sit with you until you're okay.
Yes. Hold their hand.
Yes.
Literally
bring
sit
that,
there with them.
bring that brotherhood back to
Yeah,
them,
no, it's not okay. And so much of the time, obviously, I'm not a clinician, but it's like so much of the time I feel like it's so beneficial just to sit next to somebody and just be very genuine and be like, hey, it's okay. I don't know how to help you, but I'm going to sit here with you until we figure this shit out.
Yeah.
There's something to be said for finding a person that will sit in silence with you when you are at your lowest point and in your darkness. And even just like literally in silence, just having the presence of another person who is willing to donate their time to you to sit in the darkness with you and not even say a word. Those are special humans. Those are angels on earth in my eyes.
One of my best friends said something similar to me, where he just said that he knew like that we were best friends because we could spend hours together and not say a word to each other. And so that totally makes sense. Yes, I really agree with that.
Yeah.
So that was our crisis intervention program. The last call that I had was on the way here. Like it is, I've been blown away by how busy it's been. But the interesting thing about it is we've had veterans go into the hospital for like an injury, like a knee or an ankle or whatever. And then they get linked up with us, and we found out that they were thinking about suicide recently or something like that. So that has been amazing to be able to connect with those veterans, whereas otherwise we wouldn't have been able to.
Yeah.
So that's a great program that we were able to get started. Our outreach program, we have two. One is Troops on Trails, the other is Veiled Valor. Veiled Valor is our all-female veteran outreach group. So common sense is common experience. I was in the infantry, just dudes when I was over there. And then when I got home and I started PHAT, Project Headspace and Timing, female veteran came to my organization. And unfortunately, she dealt with military sexual trauma. And she dealt with a lot of other stuff. And she didn't want to go anywhere else. So I was like, okay, we'll figure something out. And so I started educating myself on MST and programs that could help veterans with MST or that dealt with MST. And we created Veiled Valor. And the first meeting is just all female veterans doing whatever they want to do. And I made the stupid mistake of like making a suggestion. Because like the first meeting with them, I was like, my whole thing was like, I want to make sure we provide childcare for every event, so you don't have to worry about anything, and we just go do cool stuff. And so I was like, you guys should go on a yoga retreat and blah blah blah. And they were like, can we go to like a rage room or something?
They want to break shit.
You know what? Like, I'm just gonna fuck you. Right? You guys do whatever you want. I'm not gonna tell you what to do. I'm sorry. Whatever. Like, just check in so I know how much stuff costs.
Yep.
We have to make sure. So they get to do that like once a month. They're always doing new events, which is really cool. And then Troops on Trails. So my family has cabins in northern Wisconsin. It's in the middle of the woods. There's no cell service. It's my favorite place in the world. So after every deployment, that's where I would go. My mom passed away last year. That's where we spread her ashes. Like it is my favorite place, right? And so I've always loved being outdoors. I've always found there to be a huge benefit to my own mental health by just sitting on the river or on a lake or whatever.
We talk about that a lot on this show.
I love that. And then luckily I got hooked up with another amazing local veteran named Nick Smith, who also loves doing all that. And he had an idea, and he was like, I'm almost positive he came up with the idea, the name Troops on Trails. And he told me he wanted to start getting veterans outside more. I was like, that's exactly what we want to do. So we got a 20-foot trailer wrapped, and we have kayaks, mountain bikes, hiking equipment, fishing equipment, and camping equipment. And we try to take veterans out whenever we can and just support, show them that they can be in a very supportive environment that doesn't have to revolve around alcohol or drugs or whatever. Now, that's not to say that some of our events don't have alcohol. Like, I am very much about adult rules. If you're coming to our organization for an event and you're like, hey, I don't want to be around that stuff, totally fine. We'll make sure that we have events where there is no temptation, no nothing, because everybody's different. If you don't want to be about it, I can absolutely respect that. And then there's other times where we have events where there may be alcohol present. You know what I mean? But so we kind of test the waters with both. We got linked up with Veterans Treatment Court recently, and they send their veterans that are going through the legal system to us so we can take them out to do outreach stuff. And those events are obviously drug-free, alcohol-free, where again, we're just showing you that there's a lot of things you can do and have fun. It doesn't have to revolve around drugs and alcohol.
Right.
The archery program we just got started up, that's been phenomenal. We just sent veterans down south on their first bow hunting trip. And to be able to show veterans that they really can do whatever they want is such an empowering and beautiful thing. We have a veteran who's blind. He's like 95% blind, 100% blind in one eye, almost 100% in the other eye. And he was down on himself for a while because he didn't feel like he could do a lot. And he's been coming to our archery classes for like the past few months, and he's just killing it.
Love
and
it.
Like, to see that and know that he is doing that by himself, no one's doing that for you. And you're showing yourself that you are more than whatever this thing is that you think is holding you back.
Yep.
So that's Troops on Trails. We're trying to do events usually every other week or so. And then we also helped get a peer support group started here in Bradley. It's called Lima Charlie. So that's through another organization we partner with called Operation Charlie Bravo. And it's a peer support group for veterans. So we've been meeting in 2 weeks. It'll be our year anniversary. Every single Monday from 7 to 9. There are no professionals. It is just veterans sharing whatever they want to share in a space where they know that it's free of judgment and unconditional love. You say whatever you want to say. And so I've been very happy to see that group getting bigger and bigger and getting newer veterans every time. So those are what we're doing from an outreach perspective.
Wow.
Holy cow.
I know. That's no joke.
Amazing.
Thank you.
That's pretty amazing. And I know you said you're involved pretty heavily with the local veterans homes too. What's your involvement there? What does that look like? For anyone watching or listening that has no idea what a veterans home is, or what that looks like.
Yeah. So the veterans home, the Illinois Veterans Home in Manteno, I forget how many veterans it houses. I want to say like 200 or more. I always loved volunteering out there because I met veterans that had stories that would blow you away, like that should have movies. Like I met a 19-year-old named Ed Kernatz it wasn't 19 when he was in the veterans home. His name was Ed Kernatz. He was 19 at the Battle of the Bulge, like telling me how it felt to be there. And like he remembered every moment like it happened yesterday. And he let me record the whole conversation.
Wow.
There's a guy named George Tiedemann, who is the sweetest old man you've ever seen in your life. And he was a corpsman in Korea. He was on the front lines. He treated over 1,000 guys. He did battlefield amputations. He removed an appendix. He had 0 medical experience before being a corpsman. And he got shot down in a plane, not once, but on 2 separate occasions. And he pulled bullets out of himself. Like, he had the most insane story. And it's just this.
He's like Rambo.
Old man. And I'm just like, I was like, dude, can I get you something? And he goes, I like O. Henry candy bars. I'm like, got it. I get online. I order boxes of O. Henry candy bars. I bring them to the nurse's station. I'm like, if George asks for a candy bar, please just give him a
lifetime supply.
Next time I go in there, George yells at me because he says I'm making him fat. And I'm like, dude, what do you, like, you want naming rights to my children? Like, you have such an insane story, and you're asking for nothing. All he wanted was somebody to sit and hang out with him for a few minutes. And there's so many veterans like that out there.
I have a cool story, actually. I worked at a bank, and his name was Joe. I can't for the life of me remember his last name right now, but he was in the he jumped out of the second plane of the 101st Airborne on D-Day.
What?
Yeah, he was he was 101st Airborne. He was the second plane, jumped out. 6 people from his group survived. He had a purple star. He was the most amazing human being. He was the happiest man I'd ever met.
Hell yeah.
Sweetest dude ever. Yeah. He's like, just make sure you keep being sassy. Like, he was one of my favorite humans. But yeah, like the stories he could tell me about that day were just, I would just sit there and like, wow.
I just have to imagine it's because like they were. If you were so, and this doesn't just pertain to the veteran community, but like when you come so close to death, it's a car accident, medical issue, whatever it is, it's almost impossible to not have like that new lease on life. Where you're just like, I appreciate the shit out of everything
literally
right now. And like when I first came home for my first deployment, like I said, I saw a little combat, and I come home and I'm thinking like, you know, I'm a pretty big tough guy now because I saw some combat. And I'm at the veterans home one day because I was working for Riverside.
You got real humble, didn't you?
Super humble, super quick. There was another sweet old man, and he's just like, oh, so were you in the service? And I was like, yeah. And he goes, did you see any combat? I was like, yep. And he asked me what happened, and he asked me if I saw any IEDs, and I was in an MRAP, which is a gigantic vehicle. It's like 38,000 pounds up armored, and the bottom of an MRAP is designed like a V. So if you hit an IED, it goes out the sides. So it was the 4th of July, coincidentally, and I hit the IED. I was in the back of the MRAP. Thank God, everybody was okay. We were okay. Like it rung our bell a little bit. But that was when I hit the IED. So I told him that story. He was like, "That's pretty crazy." I'm like, "Yep, sure is." And then he proceeds to tell me about how he was on some submarine, and there was like 1,800 guys on it, and it got hit by whatever, and they all went into the water, like 400 came out.
Oh my
God. There were sharks and shit. I'm like, listen, man, I'm just gonna
see my way out.
See ya.
All right, I got it. I'm sorry.
Thanks.
I needed to be humbled in that moment. I needed to understand that while I went through this, that, and the other, there were many that came before me that went through way more.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So yeah, hearing those types of veterans get to share their stories, it's invaluable because they're only here for so long. That's why I always encourage people, go to the veterans home and just hang out with some of those folks. That's all they want. They just want somebody to hang out with, and they have the coolest stories.
Yeah.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. And I love, just people like you and organizations like you run, and even just other military veterans just trying to do good, because I really think there's something to be said about you guys being able to share those stories versus, just them telling another civilian or trying to share with their families, because we ultimately don't understand.
We don't understand.
We don't have that level of empathy and compassion that you would have for one another. So I think that you're providing those connections for so many of those people when they ultimately might not have that, I think is so special.
Sure. But also on the other side of that, it's like the only way, so many veterans push themselves away from the civilian community because they're like, well, they don't understand. Mm-hmm. It's like, okay, that's not their fault. Like we have to try to have those conversations.
Yeah.
Because if you look at trauma medicine in the civilian, like stateside, follows the military. Like tourniquets for a while, they said, don't use tourniquets. And then I think it was, I don't know if it was Vietnam or Iraq, but they started seeing that they were losing a lot of soldiers to limbs, to like limb bleeds. And so all of a sudden tourniquets in the military were like, hey,
back in.
That was the last thing to do. Now it's the first thing you do. And then all of a sudden it caught on back here. I think mental health is the same way because again, you have the veteran space, very diverse, going through trauma. Civilians obviously can go through plenty of trauma, but we're looking at the military community, figuring out what works for them. And then that should also get passed on to the civilian world. Because I genuinely don't believe anyone is any more important than anyone else. I just think that everybody has a piece to play. And I think that too many veterans, I shouldn't say too many, but I think that some veterans just disconnect completely. And I understand why, because it's so hard to be vulnerable. But what it seems like is if you're willing to be vulnerable and get back into your community, that you have a lot to offer that community, and that community has a lot to offer you. Then it makes you feel like you're part of a team again. And so like the other part of our outreach is just doing things in our community, volunteering for other organizations like Sleep in Heavenly Peace and Let's Catch Up and Days with Dads and all that other stuff. Because it's letting them know that, no, you have something to do here. I think the worst thing you can give a veteran is everything. Like, I need something to do. Like, I need a mission. I need
a sense
goals.
of purpose. It's a deep sense of purpose.
I don't want to just sit here and then people are like, thanks for your service. I'm like, okay, like, give me something to do.
And I think too, hearing a civilian's trauma and a veteran's trauma or active military trauma, you might be able to gain something from the other person, even though you're comparing apples to oranges. But I feel like everybody experiences trauma. Some people experience much more trauma, and veteran trauma is its own special kind of like niche within trauma. But I really think that if you're willing to just be open to listening to anybody that has experienced something traumatic in their life, you might be able to learn something from it. You might, whether you're a veteran or a civilian, or vice versa. So I think that, like you said, kind of honing in on that kind of collaboration between the two. It doesn't have to be like black and white. It can be like, it can be this beautiful gray area that can, we can kind of all interweave together. Yes.
Especially when it comes to like treatment.
Correct. Exactly. That's what I'm saying. And because
it's like, I look at trauma veterans and you have, if you have trauma, I look at combat veterans. And if you look at like your stereotypical combat veteran or whatever, you think about like some big bearded, tattooed up guy. They recommend yoga, right? And at first, I was one of those guys. I was like, whatever.
Yoga.
So my wife is deep into yoga, and it took me all of 5 minutes of my first time being in a yoga class where I was like, oh, I get it. Yep. All right. It's not that easy. And it is just like working out or anything like that. It's very beneficial. I have a lot of combat veteran friends that love doing yoga, that found that in therapy, and that really worked for them. And you see all of these different branches, these holistic treatments and all this other stuff that's out there. And a lot of it, from a published perspective, a published study perspective, starts in the military. Like they're doing studies with psychedelics and MDMA and all this other stuff. And they're seeing all of these pros. And then hopefully in equine therapy, with horses, like you're seeing that happen with these little groups of combat veterans. And my hope is that will just extend into the civilian world. And then the civilian world is sharing some of the things that they're doing to deal with trauma. And hopefully that's bleeding over into the military side too.
Yeah. I love
especially with psychedelics. I could talk about that for a while.
Me too.
That's the next episode.
Because I think that is a key component to helping. Yeah, it's a very interesting topic.
You guys sound like Aaron Rodgers.
Oh my God.
Yeah. Anyway, go into the darkness. Tell me about it.
Like Aaron Rodgers.
I know. My husband won't admit it, Adam, if you're watching this, but he feels the same. So I could probably talk to you for hours, but I want to know what some of your favorite resources are. Not necessarily the programs you talked about, but if there's any books, documentaries, movies, anything
Other
like that.
podcasts or anything.
And your podcast, I want to know a little bit more about too.
Yeah. So books. One of my favorite books is the Book of Five Rings by Miyamoto Musashi.
Okay, I have that.
So you're familiar?
Mhm.
So I love his story just because he was arguably the greatest swordsman to have ever been.
Walked the face of the earth.
Like,
yes.
he was braining dudes with a wooden training sword.
Mhm.
Like,
What?
he couldn't be beat.
It's amazing.
He's insane.
Bring it. I'll read it.
Like 60-some battles. He was in wars and stuff. He
Mhm.
was a samurai without a master. And then when he was older, he went up to the top of a mountain and he wrote a book about like finding enlightenment through just war.
Yeah.
Like, that's pretty much what the Book of Five Rings is.
Wow.
And
Book of
then,
Five Rings.
and then he took the skills from learning his two-sword fighting style and he applied it to being a master of the tea ceremony and being a painter.
Stop.
And all this. So I have one of his paintings. Obviously, it's a reprint. It's called The Shrike. And it's this bird on a really long blade of grass. And like in the Book of Five Rings, the narrator in the very beginning talks about this painting. And he talks about how courageous of a brushstroke that blade of grass is. Because it's almost like you can tell that he was a swordsman by how he painted that blade of grass. And it was so cool to me. So that's one of my favorite books. And like I mentioned earlier, Siddhartha is one of my favorite books. Man's Search for Meaning.
Siddhartha. That book.
So great.
Oh,
it's so solid.
It's quick
short.
read.
Yeah,
it's a very
not very
quick read, and it makes you just go, oh.
Because
I call it Siddhartha is how I say it, but you can.
I might be wrong. I have no idea.
No, but like, because when you said it, I was like, and then I was like, oh, but and I think the translation of it is loosely, however, because it's a Indian word.
And like, spoiler alert, the whole book is about like the way he found enlightenment by fucking up.
Exactly.
Like, that was how he found it.
Yeah, that
And
book is
then
amazing.
All of these monks were like, "Hey, you're enlightened now. How'd that happen?" It's like, I don't know. You know what I mean? Like,
Messed up a whole lot.
Yep. Up a bunch. So
I love that.
I love Siddhartha. I love what's that? There's another really popular that is more in line with like being a self-help book. And while typically I don't like specific self-help books, this one was a phenomenal one. He talks about incremental improvements. It wasn't Tim Ferriss, but
Tim Kennedy?
No, I'm gonna think about it, and it's gonna really piss me off. I'm trying to think of some others. Emotional Awareness by Dr. Paul Ekman and the Dalai Lama. Mm-hmm. It's just conversations between him and the Dalai Lama about like life, and some of the Dalai Lama's responses for how he would react to things were like really interesting because he wasn't as peaceful of a person as you would think. Mm-hmm. So I think those are my James Clear.
Oh, I love James Clear.
Oh, yeah.
What's that book?
Atomic Habits.
Mm-hmm. Atomic Habits.
I think everyone should read that book.
Everybody should read that book.
Yeah. And again, I'm typically against like popular stuff for the most part, just because I don't know why.
Yeah, I'm surprised that book came out of your mouth.
But I started listening to that book and I was like, this is great. Like,
the
first chapter about that cyclist team.
You can apply it to just about anything. I read it because I was trying to build a business, so like becoming an entrepreneur. So I thought this would be helpful. But the more I read it, I was like, oh, I can apply this to my relationships, my finances, my mental health, all of it. Really,
I read it on how to just basically be a better human. Altogether.
Yeah.
Have you read Epictetus? It's another short book. He was a philosopher in ancient times.
Epictetus. I've
I say
some
it different.
Of his letters that he would write to people, but I've never read any of his specific books.
Okay, that's a good one. You might like. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's a very stoic.
Stoicism in general has been such a great way for me to deal with like any trauma.
I think everyone should, like, if you don't know what that is, Google Stoicism and just do a little digging. I mean, I think it's so interesting.
Well, and like I mentioned before, so last year, I lost my mom, and I'm a mama's boy for good reason. She was the best woman ever. And like, she was on hospice care. I was there for all that. And like, when I was at my worst points, again, I reached back to those books. I reread Siddhartha. I reread Man's Search for Meaning, like, because those books reaffirm, and I reread Meditations. And like those Stoic principles kind of helped me get through all that. So that's why all that stuff is so beautiful. it's not like you just read it once and you're like, I'm great now. It's like you got to reread them.
Reread them all.
I agree.
Sure,
Absolutely.
I agree. Tell us just briefly a little bit more about your podcast, the I'm F.I.N.E Podcast. Tell us what that is, what you guys talk about, and I'll be sure to include it in the show notes too, so people can go listen.
Yes, thank you. So it's called I'M F.I.N.E, the I'M F.I.N.E Podcast, which stands for Freaked Out, Insecure, Neurotic, and Emotional. It's started by...
I like a good acronym.
So, it's from the movie Italian Job. That's where I stole it from.
I was like, I know this is from
Mark
something. Yep.
And Donald Sutherland asks him if he's okay. Mark's like, I'm fine. And he says, you know what, I'm fine. You know what FINE stands for? It says that. That's awesome. So it's myself and that blind veteran that I mentioned. He's the other co-host. He was incredibly frustrated for a very long time because so many people didn't understand what he was dealing with and he wanted to talk about it. So that's where the idea started to do a podcast, because I love talking about mental health. He loves talking about it. And we realized that we could do a podcast that's kind of military centered, but not military specific. Anybody with any interest in mental health can like get something out of it. But we bring a lot of our experience from the military side into it, right? And so we have guests on. We talk about all different types of topics, anything that's even somewhat relatable to mental health. Our last episode was about hating ourselves. And we had a Navy veteran on who's a rescue diver who dealt with situations where he had to save people and he couldn't save everybody. And like the trauma that he deals with from that won't go away. And so it's just been a really good opportunity for us to have other people that we respect and admire to come on and share their own personal stories. We had Sebastian